15 years ago, Anthony Ramirez stepped into the Union Station metro platform in downtown Los Angeles for what would be his final performance. The 26-year-old street musician, known for his soulful guitar melodies that could make commuters stop mid-stride, vanished without a trace after packing up his guitar case that October evening in 2009. His disappearance plunged his close-knit family into a nightmare of unanswered questions and drove the local music community into confusion and fear. The Los Angeles Police Department considered multiple possibilities: robbery gone wrong, voluntary disappearance, even human trafficking. But despite extensive searches through the city's underground tunnels and homeless encampments, they found nothing. The case went cold, leaving behind a devastated family who never stopped believing their beloved Anthony was still out there, somewhere, waiting to come home. Before we continue, subscribe and hit the bell. Here we reopen archived cases with respect and evidence. The last person to see Anthony alive was Maria Santos, a fellow street performer who often shared the same metro stops with him. Anthony was different that night, Maria would later tell investigators, her voice trembling with the weight of memory. He kept looking over his shoulder like someone was watching him. When I asked if everything was okay, he just smiled that sad smile of his and said, "Sometimes the music has to end, Maria. But the melody lives forever." Those cryptic words would haunt investigators for years to come. Anthony's mother, Carmen Ramirez, a hard-working housekeeper who had immigrated from El Salvador in the 1980s, refused to accept that her son had simply vanished. "My Anthony, he would never leave without saying goodbye," she insisted, during countless interviews with detectives. "He called me every night after his performances, every single night. Something terrible happened to my boy." Carmen's unwavering faith in her son's return became both her strength and her torment, as she spent the next decade and a half searching every corner of Los Angeles, posting flyers with Anthony's gentle smile on telephone poles and bus stops throughout the city. The investigation initially focused on Anthony's routine. Every weekday he would take the Red Line from his small apartment in MacArthur Park to various metro stations throughout LA, setting up his guitar case and performing for hours. He was particularly popular at Union Station, where his acoustic covers of classic rock and original compositions drew regular audiences of commuters who often left generous tips. Detective Ray Morrison, the lead investigator on the case, discovered that Anthony had been earning enough from his street performances to support not only himself, but also help his mother with rent and groceries. This wasn't some troubled kid living on the streets, Morrison noted in his case files. Anthony was responsible, reliable, and deeply loved by his community. People like that don't just disappear. The first major break seemed to come 3 weeks after Anthony's disappearance, when his guitar case was found in a dumpster behind a fast food restaurant in East LA, nearly 10 miles from Union Station. The case was empty, except for a few crumpled dollar bills and a handwritten note that simply read, "The music never dies." Forensic analysis revealed no fingerprints other than Anthony's, and the handwriting was confirmed to be his. This discovery only deepened the mystery. Why would Anthony dispose of his most prized possession, the guitar case that had been with him for over 5 years? Detective Morrison theorized that Anthony might have been forced to abandon his belongings, possibly during a robbery or abduction, but without the actual guitar or any witnesses, the case stalled. As months turned into years, the Anthony Ramirez case joined the growing pile of cold cases in the LAPD's files. The initial media attention faded. The missing person posters became weathered and torn, and the regular searches organized by Carmen and the local community grew smaller and less frequent. But Carmen Ramirez never stopped believing. Every anniversary of Anthony's disappearance, she would return to Union Station with fresh flowers and a small amplifier, playing recordings of her son's music for anyone who would listen. "I know he's out there," she would tell reporters who occasionally covered the anniversary. "A mother knows my son is out there, and someday someone will help bring him home." The case that had once captured the attention of local news stations and community activists gradually faded from public consciousness, becoming just another unsolved mystery in a city full of them. But in the shadows of Los Angeles, in the corners where street musicians still gathered to share their art and stories, Anthony Ramirez's name lived on. His music, recorded on various smartphones and shared through social media, continued to reach new audiences. Young musicians who had never met Anthony began covering his original songs, keeping his melodies alive even as the search for the man himself seemed hopeless. The ghost of his music haunted the very metro stations where he once performed, a bittersweet reminder of talent silenced too soon. The years following Anthony's disappearance were marked by a series of false leads and crushing disappointments that tested the Ramirez family's resolve. In 2011, a homeless man claimed to have seen Anthony living in the storm-drained tunnels beneath downtown LA, leading to an extensive search that yielded nothing but empty bottles and abandoned shopping carts. In 2013, a woman in San Diego called police saying she was certain she had seen Anthony performing at a beach boardwalk, but when investigators arrived, they found only a musician who bore a passing resemblance to the missing man. Each false alarm sent Carmen's hopes soaring before crashing them down again, wearing away at her spirit like water on stone. Detective Morrison, who had been promoted to sergeant by 2012, never fully let go of the Anthony Ramirez case. Even as new investigations demanded his attention, he found himself returning to the file during quiet moments, studying the crime scene photos and witness statements for any detail he might have missed. There was something about that kid, Morrison would later reflect. Maybe it was seeing his mother's faith, or maybe it was the way the whole music community rallied around his memory. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we had missed something important, something that would make all the pieces fall into place. Carmen Ramirez's devotion to finding her son transformed her from a quiet housekeeper into a fierce advocate for missing persons. She connected with other families dealing with similar tragedies, forming support groups and organizing search parties for various cold cases throughout Los Angeles. Her small apartment became a makeshift command center with walls covered in missing person flyers, maps marking potential search areas, and boxes full of tips and leads that had never been properly investigated. Anthony taught me that music brings people together, Carmen would explain to visitors. Now I use that same spirit to bring families together, to make sure no one feels alone in their search for answers. The music community that had embraced Anthony during his brief career refused to let his memory fade. Annual benefit concerts were held at various venues around Los Angeles, raising money for missing person organizations and keeping Anthony's story in the public eye. Local musicians began incorporating one of Anthony's original compositions, City of Angels, City of Shadows, into their sets, turning the haunting ballad about urban loneliness into an anthem of remembrance. The song's lyrics, which Anthony had written about feeling invisible in a city of millions, took on new meaning in the context of his disappearance. In this city of angels, I walk alone, city of shadows, so far from home, but every stranger's face might hold the key to the mystery of what happened to me. By 2014, 5 years after Anthony's disappearance, the case had been officially designated as a cold case, though Carmen continued to call Detective Morrison monthly with new theories and potential leads. The detective, now nearing retirement, had grown genuinely fond of Carmen and admired her unwavering determination. She never gave up, Morrison recalled. Even when we had to tell her that another lead had gone nowhere, she would thank us for trying and ask what else she could do to help. That kind of faith, it changes you as an investigator. It makes you want to work harder, to turn over one more stone, to make one more phone call. The break that everyone had been hoping for seemed to come in early 2015, when construction workers renovating an old warehouse in the Arts District discovered what appeared to be Anthony's guitar, partially buried beneath debris in the building's basement. The instrument, a vintage acoustic guitar with distinctive mother-of-pearl inlays that Carmen immediately recognized as belonging to her son, was damaged but still identifiable. However, forensic examination revealed that the guitar had been deliberately broken and showed signs of having been exposed to the elements for an extended period. More puzzling still, the guitar's neck had been carefully carved with symbols and numbers that investigators couldn't immediately decipher: 7 to 23, 47 N, 1118, 15 W, followed by a crude drawing of what appeared to be an angel with broken wings. The discovery reignited interest in Anthony's case, bringing Detective Morrison out of retirement to work as a consultant on the investigation. The symbols carved into the guitar neck appeared to be coordinates, and when investigators followed them, they led to a location in Griffith Park, near the famous observatory. A thorough search of the area revealed nothing of immediate significance, but the discovery confirmed what investigators had long suspected. Anthony hadn't simply walked away from his life. Someone had taken great care to leave these clues, suggesting either that Anthony himself had hidden the guitar as a message, or that someone else wanted the guitar to be found for reasons that weren't yet clear. Carmen Ramirez stood in the basement where her son's broken guitar had been discovered, tears streaming down her face as she held the instrument that had once filled their small apartment with music. "He's trying to tell us something," she whispered to Detective Morrison. Anthony always said that music was just another language, another way to communicate what words couldn't express. These marks on his guitar, they're not random. They're a message, and we need to understand what he was trying to say. The discovery of the guitar marked the beginning of a new phase in the investigation, one that would ultimately lead to revelations that no one could have anticipated. The carved coordinates and the mysterious angel symbol sparked countless theories among amateur investigators and true crime enthusiasts who had been following Anthony's case online. Some suggested that the numbers might refer to a specific date or location that had personal significance to Anthony. Others theorized that the angel symbol might be connected to Anthony's Catholic upbringing, or perhaps to a person or place that had been important in his life. The broken wings on the carved angel seemed particularly symbolic to many observers, representing perhaps Anthony's own broken dreams or his fall from grace. But despite intensive investigation and analysis, the true meaning of Anthony's message remained frustratingly out of reach, like a song played just beyond the range of human hearing. The discovery of Anthony's guitar created a media sensation that thrust the Ramirez family back into the spotlight after years of quiet suffering. News trucks lined Carmen Street in MacArthur Park, and reporters hungry for updates camped outside the LAPD headquarters, where Detective Morrison and his team were working around the clock to decode the mysterious symbols. The attention brought both hope and unwanted scrutiny to Carmen, who found herself fielding calls from psychics, amateur detectives, and conspiracy theorists convinced they could solve the puzzle that had stumped professional investigators. "Suddenly everyone was an expert on my son's case," Carmen would later recall. "People who had never met Anthony were telling me what the symbols meant, what happened to him, even where I should look for his body. It was overwhelming and painful, but I had to stay focused on the possibility that this guitar might finally lead us to the truth." Detective Morrison assembled a task force that included cryptographers, forensic analysts, and behavioral profilers to examine every aspect of the guitar and its mysterious engravings. The coordinates 7 to 2347 N118 15W were confirmed to point to a specific location in Griffith Park, but repeated searches of the area had revealed nothing of significance. The numbers could also be interpreted in multiple ways, as dates, times, or even references to specific locations within Los Angeles. The date interpretation was particularly intriguing. 723 could refer to July 23rd, which happened to be Anthony's birthday, while 47 might indicate 1947, the year Griffith Observatory was open to the public. However, without additional context, these connections remained purely speculative. The angel symbol with broken wings proved even more enigmatic. Religious experts consulted by the police suggested it might represent a fallen angel or a soul in distress, while art historians noted similarities to various artistic styles popular in East LA murals. Carmen revealed that Anthony had always been fascinated by angels and had often sketched them in the margins of his song notebooks, but she couldn't recall him ever drawing one with broken wings. "Anthony believed in guardian angels," she explained to investigators. "He used to tell me that every person had an angel watching over them, protecting them from harm. If he drew this angel with broken wings, it might mean he felt abandoned, like his protection had failed him." As the investigation intensified, disturbing details about Anthony's final weeks began to emerge. Fellow street musicians revealed that Anthony had seemed increasingly paranoid and agitated in the months before his disappearance. Marcus Williams, a saxophone player who often performed near Anthony at Union Station, told police that Anthony had mentioned feeling watched and had expressed concern about people asking too many questions about his schedule and performance locations. "Anthony was usually pretty chill, you know," Marcus explained, "but in those last few weeks he was jumpy, always looking around like he expected trouble. When I asked him what was wrong, he just said he'd gotten mixed up with the wrong crowd and was trying to get out." The revelation that Anthony might have been involved with dangerous individuals opened up new avenues of investigation. Detective Morrison's team began exploring connections between Anthony and various criminal organizations known to operate in downtown Los Angeles. Street musicians were often vulnerable to extortion schemes, drug dealing operations that used them as lookouts, and human trafficking networks that preyed on young people living on the margins of society. However, everyone who knew Anthony described him as clean living and focused solely on his music and family responsibilities. Anthony didn't drink, didn't do drugs, and barely even cursed, Carmen insisted. If he got involved with bad people, it wasn't by choice. Someone must have forced him or tricked him somehow. The investigation took an unexpected turn when forensic analysis of the guitar revealed traces of blood that had been carefully cleaned but not completely removed. DNA testing confirmed that the blood belonged to Anthony, suggesting that he had been injured at some point before or during the time the guitar was carved. The blood evidence, combined with the deliberate nature of the carvings, painted a troubling picture of Anthony's final hours. Either he had injured himself while carving the message, or someone else had carved the symbols while Anthony was bleeding, possibly as a form of torture or coercion. The thought that her son might have suffered before his death sent Carmen into a deep depression that worried her friends and family members. As winter approached in 2015, 6 years after Anthony's disappearance, the investigation seemed to stall once again, despite the renewed attention and resources. The guitar had provided more questions than answers, and the various leads generated by the media coverage had failed to produce any concrete breakthroughs. Detective Morrison found himself questioning whether they were interpreting the symbols correctly, or whether Anthony's message was meant to be understood in a completely different way. "We kept thinking like cops," Morrison later reflected. "We were looking for addresses, dates, names, concrete information that would lead us to evidence. But Anthony was an artist, a musician. Maybe his message wasn't meant to be literal. Maybe it was metaphorical, symbolic, something that required a different kind of understanding." The turning point came from an unexpected source, Dr. Elena Vasquez, a professor of ethnomusicology at UCLA, who had been following the case in the news. Dr. Vasquez contacted the police with a theory that the symbols might not be coordinates at all, but rather a form of musical notation that Anthony had invented or adapted for his own use. Many street musicians develop their own systems for remembering songs and marking important musical passages, she explained to Detective Morrison. If Anthony was trying to leave a message about his disappearance, he might have used a language he was most comfortable with, the language of music. These numbers and symbols might represent notes, chords, or even a specific song that holds the key to understanding what happened to him. This new perspective breathed fresh life into the investigation and gave Carmen renewed hope that her son's message could finally be decoded. The idea that Anthony might have used his musical expertise to leave clues about his fate resonated with everything the family knew about his character and priorities. Music had been his life, his passion, and his way of communicating with the world around him. If he was in danger and needed to leave a message, it made perfect sense that he would use the language he knew best, the universal language of music that had defined his short but meaningful life. If this case has already captured your attention, leave a like. It helps Anthony Ramirez's story reach more people. Dr. Elena Vasquez's theory about Anthony's musical message transformed the entire investigation from a traditional missing person case into something resembling an archaeological dig into the mind of a desperate artist. Working closely with Detective Morrison's team, Dr. Vasquez brought her extensive knowledge of musical notation systems, folk traditions, and street musician culture to bear on the cryptic symbols carved into Anthony's guitar. Street musicians often develop highly personal systems for remembering songs, especially when they can't read traditional sheet music, she explained to the assembled task force. Anthony might have created his own musical shorthand, a code that would be meaningless to most people, but would contain vital information for those who understood his particular system. The breakthrough came when Dr. Vasquez noticed that the numbers 7 to 2347 could be interpreted as musical intervals when combined with the coordinate-like format. In Anthony's system, as she theorized, 7 might represent the 7th note of a scale, 23 could indicate a specific fret position on a guitar, and 47 might refer to beats per minute or a measure number in a particular song. The letters N and W that followed the numbers could stand for musical directions, N for natural, as opposed to sharp or flat, and W for whole note, or even waltz time. This interpretation suggested that Anthony wasn't pointing to a physical location, but rather to a specific piece of music that held significance to his disappearance. Carmen Ramirez was initially skeptical of this musical interpretation, having hoped that the coordinates would lead directly to her son's location. However, when Dr. Vasquez played various chord progressions based on Anthony's numerical code, Carmen immediately recognized fragments of melodies that her son used to hum around their apartment. "That's Anthony's music," she whispered, tears flowing as the familiar patterns filled the police station's conference room. "Those are the sounds he would make when he was working out a new song, when he was trying to perfect something that was bothering him." If Elena is right, then Anthony was trying to tell us about a specific song, something that might explain what happened to him. The investigation team spent weeks analyzing Anthony's known repertoire, cross-referencing the musical code with recordings of his performances that had been captured on smartphones and uploaded to social media. The process was painstaking and often frustrating, as Anthony's musical style incorporated elements from various traditions: classical guitar techniques learned from his uncle, folk melodies passed down through his El Salvadoran heritage, and contemporary rock and blues influences absorbed from years of busking in diverse Los Angeles neighborhoods. Dr. Vasquez noted that Anthony's musical vocabulary was remarkably sophisticated for a self-taught street musician, suggesting a natural talent that might have been nurtured into something extraordinary given the right opportunities. The angel symbol with broken wings proved to be the key that unlocked Anthony's musical message. Dr. Vasquez discovered that Anthony had been working on an original composition titled Broken Angel Blues in the months before his disappearance, a song that several witnesses remembered him performing but that had never been recorded. According to Maria Santos, the fellow street musician who had been the last person to see Anthony alive, Broken Angel Blues was Anthony's most personal composition, a haunting melody about feeling trapped between his dreams of musical success and his responsibilities to his family. "He only played it when he was really troubled about something," Maria recalled. "The song was beautiful, but incredibly sad, like Anthony was pouring all his pain and frustration into the music." When Dr. Vasquez applied Anthony's numerical code to the chord structure of Broken Angel Blues, a startling pattern emerged. The code didn't just reference the song, it pointed to specific lyrics within the composition that spoke of betrayal, deception, and fear. According to witnesses who remembered fragments of the song, one verse contained the lines, "Trust can be a dangerous thing. When angels wear the devil's ring, the music stops, the lights grow dim, when evil wears a friendly grin." These lyrics suggested that Anthony had known his attacker, that his disappearance wasn't the result of a random crime, but rather a deliberate act of betrayal by someone he had trusted. The revelation that Anthony might have been killed by someone close to him sent shockwaves through the tight-knit community of street musicians who had known and loved him. Detective Morrison immediately began re-interviewing everyone who had been part of Anthony's social circle, this time focusing on potential motives for betrayal rather than random violence. The investigation revealed that Anthony had recently come into a modest inheritance from his grandmother in El Salvador, approximately $15,000 that he had planned to use to help his mother buy a small house and perhaps invest in better musical equipment. The money wasn't a fortune, but for people living on the margins of society, it represented enough wealth to inspire dangerous envy and desperate schemes. The musical code analysis also revealed something even more disturbing. Anthony appeared to have been updating and refining his Broken Angel Blues composition right up until his disappearance, adding new verses that became increasingly paranoid and fearful. Dr. Vasquez theorized that Anthony had been using his music as a form of diary, encoding his growing anxiety and suspicions into lyrics and melodies that only he fully understood. "Artists often process trauma and fear through their work," she explained to Carmen and Detective Morrison. Anthony might have been trying to work through his suspicions about someone in his life, using his music to explore possibilities and outcomes that he was too frightened to voice directly. The fact that he carved this musical code into his guitar suggests that he knew he was in immediate danger and wanted to leave behind a message that would eventually be understood by people who knew him well enough to decode it. As winter deepened in Los Angeles, the investigation team found themselves pursuing a new and more focused line of inquiry. Instead of searching for random criminals or exploring Anthony's possible involvement with organized crime, they began examining the relationships and financial dealings within his immediate circle of friends, family members, and fellow musicians. The realization that Anthony had been systematically documenting his fears and suspicions through his music provided a roadmap for the investigation, but it also raised troubling questions about how long he had been living in fear and why he hadn't sought help from the police or his family. The answer to that question would prove to be more shocking than anyone could have imagined, revealing layers of deception and betrayal that had been hidden beneath the surface of Anthony's seemingly simple life as a street musician. The investigation into Anthony's inner circle began with the people closest to him, and Detective Morrison was surprised to discover how small and interconnected that circle actually was. Beyond his mother Carmen and his fellow street musicians, Anthony's social world consisted of only a handful of individuals: his uncle Roberto, who had taught him to play guitar, his cousin Miguel, who occasionally helped him transport his equipment, and Sandra Chen, a social worker who had been helping Anthony navigate the bureaucracy involved in claiming his grandmother's inheritance from El Salvador. Each of these relationships would come under intense scrutiny as investigators searched for the source of the betrayal that Anthony had encoded into his final musical composition. Uncle Roberto Ramirez had been Anthony's musical mentor and father figure since childhood, stepping in after Anthony's biological father abandoned the family when Anthony was just 8 years old. Roberto, a former mariachi musician who had immigrated to Los Angeles in the 1970s, had recognized his nephew's natural talent early and had spent countless hours teaching him traditional guitar techniques and folk songs from their shared Salvadoran heritage. However, when Detective Morrison interviewed Roberto about Anthony's inheritance and his final weeks, disturbing inconsistencies began to emerge. Roberto claimed to have had little contact with Anthony in the months before his disappearance, yet phone records showed frequent conversations between them, including several calls on the very day Anthony vanished. When confronted with the phone evidence, Roberto's story began to unravel. He admitted that Anthony had confided in him about the inheritance money and had asked for advice about investing it safely. Roberto revealed that he had been experiencing severe financial difficulties due to a gambling addiction that had cost him his job and his apartment, forcing him to live in his car and rely on Anthony's generosity for basic necessities. "Anthony was trying to help me get back on my feet," Roberto explained through tears during his second police interview. "He offered to loan me some of the inheritance money to help me find a new place to live and maybe start a small music lesson business. But I needed more than he was willing to give, and I made some terrible decisions." The terrible decisions Roberto referred to involved borrowing money from dangerous people to fuel his gambling addiction, debts that had spiraled out of control and put his life in danger. In desperation, Roberto had approached Anthony not just for a loan, but for the entire inheritance amount, claiming that loan sharks were threatening to kill him if he didn't pay immediately. When Anthony refused to hand over all the money, insisting instead on a more modest loan with specific conditions, Roberto felt cornered and betrayed. "I wasn't thinking clearly," Roberto confessed. "The gambling had taken over my mind completely. I convinced myself that Anthony was being selfish, that he didn't understand the danger I was in. I started thinking about ways to get that money, and God forgive me, I started planning something terrible." The revelation that Roberto had been planning to rob his own nephew sent Carmen into a state of shock that required medical attention. The idea that her brother-in-law, the man who had helped raise Anthony and had been like a father to him, could have been involved in his disappearance was almost too devastating to comprehend. Detective Morrison, however, pressed Roberto for more details about his planning and whether he had actually carried out his scheme. Roberto insisted that while he had considered robbing Anthony, he had ultimately been too cowardly to go through with it, claiming that his last conversation with Anthony had been a tearful confession about his gambling debts and a plea for help that Anthony had gently but firmly refused. The timeline of Roberto's story didn't quite align with other evidence, however, and Detective Morrison suspected that Roberto was still holding back crucial information. Phone records showed that Roberto's final call to Anthony had lasted over an hour, much longer than a simple confession and refusal would require. Additionally, Roberto's claim that he had been too cowardly to confront Anthony directly was contradicted by the evidence of careful planning suggested by Anthony's musical code and the deliberate placement of his guitar in that abandoned warehouse. Someone had clearly thought through Anthony's disappearance with considerable care, and that someone had intimate knowledge of Anthony's habits, schedule, and psychological state. The breakthrough came when Dr. Vasquez made another disturbing discovery, while continuing to analyze Anthony's musical message. Hidden within the numerical code was a reference to a specific location that only someone very familiar with Anthony's performance routine would know, a practice space beneath Union Station where street musicians often gathered to rehearse away from the crowds and transit police. This underground area, accessible through a maintenance tunnel that most commuters never noticed, had been Anthony's sanctuary when he needed to work on new material or simply escape the pressures of performing for money. The fact that this location was encoded in Anthony's message suggested that his final confrontation had taken place in the one spot where he felt most safe and creative. When police searched the underground practice area beneath Union Station, they discovered evidence that confirmed their worst suspicions. Hidden behind a pile of old construction materials, investigators found Anthony's missing guitar, the actual instrument, not just the case that had been discovered years earlier. The guitar showed signs of having been damaged in a struggle, with bloodstains on the neck and body that matched the DNA found on the guitar fragments in the warehouse. More importantly, carved into the wall near where the guitar was hidden was the rest of Anthony's message, additional musical notation that, when decoded by Dr. Vasquez, spelled out a name that shattered what remained of the Ramirez family's faith in the people they had trusted most. The name encoded in Anthony's final musical message wasn't Roberto's, as Detective Morrison had begun to suspect. Instead, the musical note spelled out Sandra, a reference to Sandra Chen, the social worker who had been helping Anthony claim his inheritance and who had been present at several family gatherings in the months before his disappearance. The discovery sent the investigation in an entirely new direction and raised questions about motives and opportunities that no one had previously considered. Sandra Chen had had access to detailed information about Anthony's inheritance, his schedule, his favorite locations, and his family relationships. She had also been in a position of trust that would have made it easy for her to lure Anthony to the underground practice space without arousing suspicion. If this case has already captured your attention, leave a like. It helps Anthony Ramirez's story reach more people. Sandra Chen's involvement in Anthony's case had always seemed peripheral to investigators, a bureaucratic necessity in the complex process of claiming an international inheritance rather than a personal relationship that might harbor dangerous secrets. The 34-year-old social worker had a spotless professional record, glowing recommendations from clients and colleagues, and no apparent criminal history or financial difficulties that might provide a motive for harming Anthony. However, as Detective Morrison's team began investigating Sandra more thoroughly, they discovered that her carefully constructed professional persona concealed a web of financial fraud and identity theft that had been operating for years beneath the surface of her legitimate social work career. The investigation revealed that Sandra had been systematically exploiting her position to gain access to her clients' personal information, using their social security numbers, addresses, and family details to apply for credit cards, loans, and government benefits in their names. Her victims were primarily undocumented immigrants and low-income individuals who were unlikely to monitor their credit reports or immediately notice fraudulent activity. Sandra had been particularly targeting clients who were in the process of receiving inheritances or insurance settlements, as these individuals often had complex financial situations that made it easier to hide additional transactions and accounts. Anthony Ramirez had been the perfect victim for Sandra's schemes, a young man with limited formal education and no experience with financial institutions, who had recently inherited a significant sum of money from a foreign country. Sandra had volunteered to help Anthony navigate the inheritance process, not out of altruism, but because she saw an opportunity to steal a substantial amount of money while appearing to provide legitimate assistance. Her plan had been to gradually skim portions of the inheritance through fraudulent fees and administrative charges, but Anthony's growing sophistication about financial matters had threatened to expose her operation before she could complete the theft. The turning point in Sandra's relationship with Anthony had come when he began asking detailed questions about the fees and charges associated with claiming his inheritance. Dr. Vasquez's analysis of Anthony's final musical compositions revealed that he had been growing increasingly suspicious about Sandra's explanations for various delays and complications in the inheritance process. In one song fragment decoded from his musical message, Anthony had written lyrics that translated roughly to "papers and promises, words without truth, stealing my future, stealing my youth. The helper's hands are taking away what should have been mine for a brighter day." When confronted with evidence of her fraud schemes, Sandra initially maintained her innocence and claimed that any irregularities in her client's financial records were the result of clerical errors or misunderstandings. However, as investigators presented more detailed evidence of her systematic theft and the specific ways she had been manipulating Anthony's inheritance case, Sandra's composed professional demeanor began to crack. The breakthrough came when Detective Morrison revealed that they had decoded Anthony's musical message and that it specifically named her as the source of his fear and suspicion. Faced with this evidence, Sandra finally confessed to her crimes, but her version of events painted Anthony's death as an accident rather than a premeditated murder. According to Sandra's confession, she had arranged to meet Anthony in the underground practice space beneath Union Station on the night of his disappearance, claiming that she needed to discuss some urgent developments in his inheritance case that couldn't wait until regular business hours. Anthony, trusting Sandra despite his growing suspicions, had agreed to the meeting and had brought his guitar with him, intending to practice after their conversation. When Sandra began pressuring Anthony to sign documents that would have given her power of attorney over his inheritance, Anthony became suspicious and refused to cooperate. The situation escalated when Anthony threatened to report Sandra to her supervisors and the police, leading to a physical confrontation that Sandra claimed had resulted in Anthony's accidental death. Sandra's account of Anthony's death was filled with self-serving details and attempts to minimize her culpability, but physical evidence contradicted many aspects of her story. The blood spatter patterns found on Anthony's guitar and the underground practice space walls suggested a violent struggle rather than an accidental death, and the careful disposal of Anthony's body and belongings indicated premeditation rather than panic. Moreover, the sophisticated nature of Anthony's musical message, carved into his guitar while he was apparently injured and in fear for his life, suggested that he had had time to realize that Sandra intended to kill him and had attempted to leave behind evidence that would eventually lead to justice. The most damning evidence against Sandra came from her own financial records, which revealed that she had been making preparations to flee Los Angeles with stolen money from multiple clients, including Anthony's inheritance. Bank records showed that Sandra had been liquidating assets and transferring money to offshore accounts in the weeks leading up to Anthony's disappearance, suggesting that she had been planning to disappear herself once she had completed her theft of Anthony's inheritance. The discovery of Anthony's resistance to her plans had apparently accelerated her timeline and forced her to eliminate the one person who could expose her crimes and prevent her escape. Carmen Ramirez listened to Sandra's confession with a mixture of grief, rage, and profound sadness that the person who had claimed to be helping her son had actually been the architect of his destruction. "She sat at our dinner table," Carmen whispered through tears. "She ate my food. She listened to Anthony play his guitar. She smiled and told us how proud we should be of him. And all the time, she was planning to steal from him, to hurt him, to take away everything he had worked for. How can someone pretend to care while planning such evil?" The betrayal was made even more painful by the realization that Anthony had died trying to protect not just his own inheritance, but the financial security of his mother and the dreams of a better life that the money represented for their family. As Sandra Chen was formally charged with first-degree murder and multiple counts of fraud and identity theft, the long journey toward justice for Anthony Ramirez finally seemed to be reaching its conclusion. The case that had begun with a simple missing person report had evolved into a complex investigation involving financial crimes, betrayal of trust, and the calculated murder of a young man whose only crime had been trusting someone who claimed to want to help him. The musical message that Anthony had managed to leave behind, encoded in the language he understood best, had ultimately provided the key to solving his murder and exposing a criminal operation that had victimized numerous vulnerable individuals throughout Los Angeles. His final song, written in blood and carved into wood, had ensured that his voice would continue to be heard long after his life had been silenced, bringing justice not only for himself, but for all of Sandra Chen's victims who had suffered in silence. The trial of Sandra Chen for the murder of Anthony Ramirez began on a cold February morning in 2016, 7 years after Anthony's disappearance, and nearly a year after the discovery that would finally bring his killer to justice. The Los Angeles County Superior Court was packed with supporters of the Ramirez family, fellow street musicians who had known Anthony, and other victims of Sandra's extensive fraud operation who had come to see justice served. Carmen Ramirez sat in the front row, clutching a small photograph of Anthony playing his guitar, her eyes fixed on the defendant who had destroyed her family while pretending to help them rebuild their lives. The prosecution, led by Deputy District Attorney Maria Rodriguez, painted a devastating picture of Sandra Chen as a calculating predator who had systematically exploited the most vulnerable members of Los Angeles society. Over the course of 8 years, Sandra had stolen over $800,000 from dozens of clients, using her position as a social worker to gain access to personal information and financial resources that she then used to fund an increasingly lavish lifestyle. Sandra Chen wasn't just a thief, Rodriguez told the jury during her opening statement. She was a hunter who stalked immigrants, the elderly, the poor, and the desperate, people who trusted the system to protect them and instead found a wolf in social workers' clothing. The evidence against Sandra was overwhelming and multifaceted. Financial records documented her systematic theft from multiple clients, while forensic analysis of Anthony's guitar and the underground practice space provided irrefutable proof that she had been present during his violent death. Most damning of all was Anthony's own musical message, which Dr. Elena Vasquez explained to the jury in painstaking detail, demonstrating how the young musician had used his final moments to encode the name of his killer and the details of her crimes into a language that only those who understood his artistic soul could eventually decipher. Sandra's defense attorney, Robert Kimmel, attempted to portray his client as a troubled woman who had made poor financial decisions but had never intended to hurt anyone. He argued that Anthony's death had been the result of a struggle that had gotten out of hand, not premeditated murder, and he challenged the reliability of interpreting Anthony's musical code as evidence of Sandra's guilt. "My client is guilty of theft, yes," Kimmel conceded to the jury, "but theft is not murder and desperation is not premeditation. Sandra Chen made terrible choices that ruined her life and the lives of others, but she is not a cold-blooded killer who planned Anthony Ramirez's death." The prosecution's case was strengthened by testimony from other victims of Sandra's fraud schemes, who painted a picture of a woman who had shown no remorse or hesitation in exploiting people who had trusted her with their most intimate financial and personal details. Maria Santos, the fellow street musician who had been the last person to see Anthony alive, testified about Anthony's growing anxiety and paranoia in the weeks before his death, describing how he had confided his suspicions about Sandra's explanations for delays in his inheritance process. "Anthony was smart about people," Maria told the jury. "He could read a crowd, know which commuters would tip and which would ignore him. When he started having doubts about Sandra, I should have encouraged him to trust his instincts, instead of telling him he was probably just nervous about the money." The most powerful testimony came from Carmen Ramirez herself, who took the witness stand to describe the devastating impact that Anthony's disappearance and Sandra's betrayal had had on her family. Speaking in a mixture of English and Spanish, with an interpreter helping when her emotions overwhelmed her ability to find the right words, Carmen told the jury about the years of searching, the false hopes and crushing disappointments, and the way that Sandra had continued to visit their home and offer comfort and support, even while knowing that she was responsible for Anthony's death. "She hugged me," Carmen testified through tears. "She brought food to our house during the worst days when I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't stop crying. She looked me in the eyes and promised me that we would find Anthony, that she would never stop helping us search for the truth. And all the time, she knew exactly where my son was because she had put him there." The defense's strategy of portraying Sandra as a desperate woman who had made tragic mistakes began to crumble when prosecutors revealed the extent of her preparation for fleeing Los Angeles with stolen money. Bank records showed that Sandra had been methodically moving funds to offshore accounts and had purchased plane tickets to several countries that don't have extradition treaties with the United States. Phone records revealed that she had been researching new identities and plastic surgery procedures that would allow her to start a new life with her stolen fortune. This evidence painted a picture not of a woman overwhelmed by circumstances, but of a calculating criminal who had been planning her escape for months before Anthony's death. The jury deliberated for 3 days before returning with their verdict: guilty of first-degree murder, guilty of fraud, guilty of identity theft, and guilty of conspiracy to commit additional crimes. As the verdict was read, Sandra Chen showed no emotion, staring straight ahead with the same composed expression she had maintained throughout the trial. Carmen Ramirez, however, collapsed in tears of relief and grief, finally able to release the tension and uncertainty that had consumed her life for 7 long years. "Anthony can rest now," she whispered to Detective Morrison, who had been sitting beside her throughout the trial. His music finally brought his killer to justice. The sentencing phase of Sandra's trial revealed the full scope of her crimes and their impact on the Los Angeles community. Judge Patricia Williams sentenced Sandra to life in prison without the possibility of parole for Anthony's murder, plus additional consecutive sentences totaling 45 years for her fraud convictions. In her sentencing statement, Judge Williams noted that Sandra had betrayed not only her individual victims, but the entire social work profession and the trust that vulnerable people place in the systems designed to protect them. "You have damaged far more than bank accounts and credit reports," the judge told Sandra. "You have damaged the faith that immigrants and low-income families have in the people and institutions that are supposed to help them build better lives. The harm you have caused will ripple through this community for generations." As Sandra Chen was led away in handcuffs to begin her life sentence, Carmen Ramirez felt a complex mixture of emotions. Justice had been served, and Anthony's killer would never again be able to harm innocent people, but no legal verdict could bring back her son or restore the years of happiness that had been stolen from their family. The trial had provided answers to the questions that had haunted her for 7 years, but it had also forced her to relive the trauma of Anthony's death and to confront the reality that evil could wear a friendly face and speak words of comfort while plotting destruction. The healing process that lay ahead would be long and difficult, but for the first time since October 2009, Carmen felt that she could begin to imagine a future that included something other than grief and searching for answers that might never come. The conviction of Sandra Chen sent shockwaves through Los Angeles' social services community and immigrant advocacy organizations, forcing a comprehensive review of the systems designed to protect vulnerable populations from exploitation. The Los Angeles County Department of Social Services launched an internal investigation that revealed systematic failures in oversight and background checking that had allowed Sandra to operate her fraud scheme for years without detection. Dozens of additional victims came forward after Sandra's conviction, describing similar experiences of financial exploitation and document manipulation that painted a picture of an operation far more extensive than anyone had initially realized. Carmen Ramirez found herself thrust into an unexpected role as an advocate for other families who had been victimized by Sandra's crimes. The strength and persistence she had developed during her 7-year search for Anthony's killer made her a powerful voice for immigration reform and victims' rights, and she began working with legal aid organizations to help other families navigate the complex process of recovering stolen funds and rebuilding their financial lives. "Anthony always said that music brings people together," Carmen explained to reporters who covered her advocacy work. "Now, I use the strength that searching for Anthony gave me to bring together families who have been hurt the same way we were hurt. This is how I keep my son's spirit alive." Dr. Z. Elena Vasquez's work in decoding Anthony's musical message gained international attention from law enforcement agencies and academic institutions interested in using artistic and cultural analysis to solve crimes. The case became a landmark example of how victims might leave coded messages using specialized knowledge or cultural references that traditional investigative techniques might overlook. Dr. Vasquez published several academic papers about the Anthony Ramirez case and began consulting with police departments on other cold cases involving artists, musicians, and individuals from specific cultural communities who might have left behind non-traditional forms of evidence. The street musician community in Los Angeles, which had been profoundly affected by Anthony's disappearance and the years of uncertainty surrounding his fate, found closure in Sandra's conviction, but also grappled with complicated feelings about trust and safety. Many musicians realized that they too had been vulnerable to the same kind of exploitation that had cost Anthony his life, and community organizations began implementing new safety protocols and financial literacy programs designed to protect artists from predatory individuals who might target them for their earnings or inheritance money. A memorial fund established in Anthony's name provided grants for music education and financial counseling services specifically designed for street performers and independent artists. Detective Morrison, who had worked the Anthony Ramirez case for 7 years and had come out of retirement to see it through to its conclusion, reflected on the lessons learned from the investigation in his final report. This case taught us that victims of violent crime might leave behind evidence in forms we don't expect or understand, Morrison wrote. Anthony Ramirez was able to identify his killer and describe her crimes using a language that was uniquely his own, the language of music. If we hadn't had Dr. Vasquez to help us decode that language, Sandra Chen might never have been brought to justice. We need to be more open to different kinds of expertise and different ways of understanding evidence if we want to solve cases that traditional methods can't crack. The financial impact of Sandra's crimes extended far beyond the immediate theft of inheritance money and benefit fraud. Her victims, primarily low-income immigrants and elderly individuals, had suffered long-term damage to their credit scores, their ability to access legitimate financial services, and their trust in government agencies and social service organizations. A class action lawsuit filed on behalf of Sandra's victims resulted in a settlement that provided some financial compensation, but many of the affected families struggled for years to rebuild their financial stability and repair the damage to their credit histories and immigration status. Anthony's uncle Roberto, who had been cleared of involvement in his nephew's death but whose gambling addiction had made him a suspect, underwent court-ordered treatment for his addiction and eventually became a counselor working with other gambling addicts in the Latino community. His experience of being investigated for Anthony's murder had been traumatic, but it had also forced him to confront the destructive patterns that had nearly cost him his family relationships and his freedom. Anthony's death saved my life in a way, Roberto reflected years later. If I hadn't been forced to face what my gambling was doing to my family, I might have ended up destroying myself and hurting other people I loved. The case also highlighted broader issues with the inheritance and international banking systems that made it difficult for immigrant families to claim legitimate inheritances from their home countries. Anthony's inheritance from his grandmother in El Salvador had been relatively modest, but the complex bureaucratic process required to claim it had made him dependent on Sandra's supposed expertise and had provided her with multiple opportunities to manipulate and exploit the situation. Legal advocates used Anthony's case as an example of why inheritance laws and banking regulations needed to be reformed to protect families from predatory individuals who target people navigating complex financial systems. As the years passed, the impact of Anthony's case continued to ripple through various communities and institutions in Los Angeles and beyond. Police departments began incorporating cultural and artistic analysis into their training programs. Social service agencies implemented stronger oversight and background checking procedures, and advocacy organizations developed new resources to help immigrants and low-income families protect themselves from financial exploitation. Anthony's musical message had not only solved his own murder, but had also created lasting changes that would protect other vulnerable individuals from falling victim to similar crimes. The underground practice space beneath Union Station, where Anthony had been killed, was eventually converted into a memorial garden and performance space dedicated to his memory and to all victims of violent crime in Los Angeles. The space featured a bronze plaque with musical notation from Anthony's final composition, along with a quote from Dr. Vasquez. "Music is a universal language that transcends death itself." In his final moments, Anthony Ramirez spoke to us across time and silence, ensuring that truth would eventually find its voice. The memorial became a gathering place for street musicians and a symbol of the power of art to seek justice even from beyond the grave. 10 years after Anthony Ramirez's disappearance, and 5 years after Sandra Chen's conviction, Carmen Ramirez stood once again at Union Station, but this time she was not searching for answers or distributing missing person flyers. Instead, She was participating in the annual Anthony Ramirez Memorial Concert, an event that had grown from a small gathering of street musicians into a major Los Angeles cultural celebration that attracted thousands of attendees and raised significant funds for music education and victim advocacy programs. The transformation of her grief into a force for positive change represented a healing journey that had been as complex and challenging as the investigation that had finally brought her son's killer to justice. The memorial concert featured performances by musicians from around the world who had been inspired by Anthony's story and by the way his final musical message had transcended death to serve justice. The event showcased not only established artists, but also street performers and amateur musicians who carried on Anthony's tradition of bringing music to everyday spaces and ordinary people. Carmen, now in her late 60s, had learned to play some of Anthony's compositions on a guitar that had been donated by a famous musician who had been moved by the case, and her performance of City of Angels, City of Shadows never failed to bring the audience to tears. Dr. Elena Vasquez, who had become something of a celebrity in both academic and law enforcement circles, used the anniversary of Anthony's case to announce the establishment of the Ramirez Institute for Cultural Forensics, a research center dedicated to developing new methods for interpreting evidence left behind by victims from diverse cultural backgrounds. The Institute's work had already helped solve several cold cases involving artists, immigrants, and individuals whose final messages had been overlooked or misunderstood by traditional investigative methods. Anthony's musical code was just the beginning, Dr. Vasquez explained to the memorial concert audience. There are probably hundreds of unsolved cases where victims tried to leave behind information using languages, symbols, or cultural references that investigators didn't recognize or understand. Detective Morrison, now fully retired and working as a volunteer coordinator for crime victim support organizations, had become a frequent speaker at police conferences and criminal justice seminars, sharing the lessons learned from the Anthony Ramirez investigation. His presentation, titled "Listening to Victims: Non-Traditional Evidence in Cold Cases," emphasized the importance of consulting with cultural experts and community leaders when investigating crimes involving individuals from specific ethnic, artistic, or professional communities. "We almost missed Anthony's message completely," Morrison would tell his audiences. "If we hadn't been lucky enough to find Dr. Vasquez, Sandra Chen might still be out there, stealing from vulnerable families and potentially killing other people who got in her way." The impact of Anthony's case extended beyond law enforcement and into popular culture, inspiring documentaries, podcasts, and even a feature film that dramatized the investigation and highlighted the broader issues of financial exploitation targeting immigrant communities. While Carmen had initially been reluctant to see her family's tragedy turned into entertainment, she eventually came to appreciate how these media productions raised awareness about the vulnerabilities that had made Anthony a target and the signs that other families should watch for to protect themselves from similar predators. Sandra Chen remained in prison, serving her life sentence without the possibility of parole, and had shown no signs of remorse or willingness to cooperate with efforts to locate additional victims or recover stolen funds. Her refusal to take responsibility for her crimes had made the healing process more difficult for her victims, but it had also strengthened their resolve to support each other and to work for systemic changes that would prevent similar crimes in the future. Several of Sandra's victims had become advocates themselves, working with legal aid organizations and immigrant rights groups to educate communities about financial fraud and the warning signs of exploitation. The street musician community in Los Angeles had been permanently changed by Anthony's case, developing stronger networks of mutual support and protection that helped individual performers avoid dangerous situations and recognize potential threats. The Anthony Ramirez Safety Fund provided emergency assistance to musicians who found themselves in dangerous situations, while the education programs, funded by the memorial concerts, taught financial literacy and legal rights to help artists protect themselves from exploitation. These programs had already prevented numerous cases of fraud and theft targeting street performers and independent artists. Carmen Ramirez's advocacy work had evolved into a full-time mission that took her throughout California and beyond, speaking to immigrant communities, law enforcement agencies, and social service organizations about the warning signs of financial exploitation and the importance of cultural competency in investigating crimes against vulnerable populations. Her transformation from a grieving mother searching for answers into a powerful voice for justice and reform had been gradual and painful, but it had given new meaning to Anthony's death and had ensured that his story would continue to protect and inspire others for generations to come. The final song of each annual memorial concert was always Broken Angel Blues, the composition that Anthony had been working on in his final weeks, and that had provided the key to solving his murder. As hundreds of musicians joined together to perform the haunting melody that Anthony had used to encode his fear and suspicion, the song took on new dimensions of meaning and power. The broken angel with damaged wings had become a symbol not of defeat and despair, but of resilience and the eternal power of truth to emerge from even the darkest circumstances. As the memorial concert concluded each year, Carmen would take the microphone for her final words to the audience, a tradition that had become one of the most moving moments of the entire event. "My son Anthony believed that music could change the world," she would say, her voice still carrying traces of her Salvadoran accent after all her years in Los Angeles. He was right, but not in the way he expected. Anthony's music didn't make him famous or wealthy while he was alive, but after his death, his final song brought a killer to justice and has helped protect countless other families from the same kind of betrayal that destroyed our lives. Anthony's melody lives on in every case solved, every crime prevented, and every family kept safe by the changes his death inspired. Subscribe to our channel to explore more archived and disturbing cases across America. Thank you for following Anthony Ramirez's story. We'll see you in the next video.